doomsday cult that seems to have taken over, and politically we seem to be pandering to that instead of dealing with the real challenges of the world. And by the way, it clearly has impact all over the place. I mean, if you look at what happened in Germany, Germany, for purely political and ideological reasons, shut down its nuclear power stations. It's now paid South Africa, and Michael Schellenberger covered this on his Substack, paid South Africa to not use coal. Well, now what? Now they import coal back from South Africa and burn it. And also, of course, they made themselves extremely dependent on Russian gas at the time, which I hope the war in Ukraine is something we get on to talking about.
Yes, I hope so too. Well, yeah, so what you get in Germany is the worst, and for all those people who are watching and listening who might have environmental concerns, look, if you have environmental concerns, one of your goals is, in principle, to improve the environment. Now, if you implement a set of policies that make energy 5 times as expensive, which is what's happened in Germany, and you improve things on the pollution front, at least you could say, well, you know, energy is much more expensive, and that's pretty hard on the poor people, but look, we've accomplished one of our own goals. And, you know, you'd have to contend seriously with an opponent who put forward an argument like that. But if the reality on the ground is, well, we made energy 5 times as expensive, we've made ourselves hyper-reliant on the Russians and a single point of failure on the energy front, and we're producing far more pollution, particularly in relationship to coal burning, and the grid is much less reliable than it used to be. It's like, well, you didn't just fail according to my definition of failure. You failed according to your definition of failure. And so how in the world is that even possibly justified? And then I think we get into the religious realm here at that point. And so Alex Epstein has done a pretty good job of laying this out. I like Lomberg on the IPCC front, and we'll get back to that, you know, accepting the idea that there will be something like 2 degrees of climate change in the next 100 years and figuring out what to do with that. But Epstein has pointed out in his new book, Fossil Fuel Future, he laid out something I'd also investigated in my Maps of Meaning book, this underlying religious narrative. And it's basically a Gaia narrative. It's an earth-worshipping metaphysic, and it is a religious in its implicit structure. And the idea is that the planet is a hapless, fragile virgin threatened by a rapacious, consuming, tyrannical giant, and that's society, and that the individual is a parasitical predator riding the back of that rapacious monster. And that is a religious narrative, and it's religious because it's a fundamental narrative that frames everything else, and it also partakes of the archetypal underlying structure that makes religious stories religious. And so you could conjure up an opposite story, right? And this would flesh out the religious landscape. The opposite story would be nature is a hideous Gorgon-like demon who's hell-bent at every aspect to freeze us into terror and devour us. So that's nature red in claw and tooth. Culture is the walled garden. It's the walls of the walled garden that protects us from the absolute ravages of nature. And the human being is a heroic enterpriser bent on entering into a relationship with the planet and with culture that approximates something like environmental stewardship. It's a much more positive vision. Now, it casts nature into disrepute and probably elevates culture to unidimensionally. But you need both sides of that picture in order to have a complete picture of the world. So kids are being offered an incomplete religious view of the world that's focused on nature as hapless virgin. And so everything is being sacrificed to her. And that's complicated by another fact. And Constantine, I think this has to do with the problem that the conservatives and the liberals, for that matter, real liberals, haven't been able to come up with a promising vision. Is that, well, adolescents enter this period that Jean Piaget called the messianic. Now, not everyone gets to that point, but relatively cognitively sophisticated kids do. And so this is about age 16 to 20, let's say. This is also when you want to induct kids into the armed forces if you actually want to manage it effectively. It's really when the final touches of their enculturation occur. It's when their prefrontal cortexes prune themselves most thoroughly. that happens also between the ages of 2 and 4, but it happens between 16 and 20. You sort of die into your adult self. Anyways, Piaget noted that people of that age, cross-culturally, have a desire to identify with a purpose that transcends themselves, and that would be cultural identity, right? And they need that. They find it in music often. They find it in their subcultures, but they need to be offered that. And there's something heroic about it, because they actually do want to look outside themselves. And then, the radical, envious lefties come along and say, well, all you have to do is wave a placard at an oil company, and now you're culture hero of the universe, and standing next shoulder to shoulder with the Messiah himself. And that's pretty damn appalling, and it's certainly not true. But in the absence of an alternative vision, then people are going to gravitate towards that, as they do. And so you can't exactly blame young people for that, even though it's tempting. Now, and then there's a narcissistic element too. So one of the things I really like about Bjorn Lomborg, he accepts the IPCC climate projections, 2 degrees in 100 years. He's attempted to model that as decrement in GDP production. So he figures, given current trends, we'll be 400% richer by the year 2100. But then you can knock off some percentage of that because of the costs of climate change. And that'll be non-trivial. I think he basically concludes we'll be like 350% richer instead of 400%. And that's not nothing, but it's by no means a catastrophe. And he's pointed out very clearly too that even in the IPCC reports themselves, there's no looming apocalypse. And the idea that there's a scientific consensus about the apocalypse, that's a lie. Now, I think the reason people want to fall for it is because we also like to accrue to ourselves unearned moral stature. And if we can get moral stature by waving a placard while we're complaining about an oil company while driving to the protest, then that's a lot easier than doing all the hard work that would be necessary to actually, start a family and operate properly in a community, and maybe join a church or join a political party and actually tromp through the difficult process of trying to figure out how to do something concrete and real that would actually be of service. And so this woke enterprise is extremely attractive to narcissists. And that doesn't mean they're all narcissists, but it's extremely attractive to narcissists. And so that's a panoply of problems, all of which we're facing simultaneously. So,
well, Jordan, let me pick up on a couple of those points. A few actually. So first of all, in